Donald Trump just walked out of the Oval Office and told the entire world something that most diplomats spend years trying to keep quiet. He said he spoke with Vladimir Putin. He said it was a very good conversation. And then, almost casually, he said he thinks Putin might be about to announce a ceasefire in Ukraine, just like that, out in the open, in front of reporters. Now, if you have been following this war for any length of time, you know how rare that kind of statement is. 4 years of devastation, thousands of lives lost, and now the man sitting in the White House is telling us, on camera, that a solution could come, in his words, relatively quickly. So what exactly happened on that call? What did Putin say? And why did Trump turn down a surprising offer that Putin made about Iran's nuclear program? Let's get into it, because there is a lot here that is not making the main headlines. First, the basics. On Wednesday, Donald Trump got on the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin. According to Trump himself, this was their first public call since March 9th, meaning roughly 2 months had passed since the two leaders last spoke directly. And this is important. A lot happened in those 2 months. The war in Ukraine continued grinding forward. Drone strikes, artillery exchanges, and civilian casualties kept piling up. Diplomatic efforts had largely stalled. And then, suddenly, this call happens. Here's where it gets interesting. Trump did not just call to check in. He came out of that conversation with something specific to say. He told reporters he suggested a little bit of a ceasefire to Putin during the call, and then he added the line that immediately caught everyone's attention. He said he thinks Putin might actually do it, that Putin might come out and announce something related to a ceasefire. Think about what that means. Trump is not saying negotiations are ongoing or that there is a framework being discussed behind closed doors. He is saying Putin may be ready to make a public announcement. That is a very different thing. That is movement. Now, before we get too optimistic, here is the part that matters most, and this is where history becomes relevant. This is not the first time Putin has agreed to pause the fighting. Last year, after similar talks with the Trump administration, Putin announced a short 3-day truce. 3 days. And here's the detail that most people missed at the time. That ceasefire was not agreed upon with Kyiv. Ukraine was not at the table. So the truce came and went, and the war continued. That history is why the diplomatic world is being careful right now. A ceasefire announced by Moscow without Ukrainian agreement is not really a ceasefire. It is a gesture, and gestures do not end wars. But here is where this moment feels different from last time. Trump is framing this not as a short pause, but as a potential gateway to a permanent end to the conflict. He said directly that he hopes a ceasefire will pave the way for a lasting peace. That is a more ambitious goal than anything we heard around last year's 3-day truce. Whether Putin shares that ambition, that is the question nobody can fully answer right now. Let's talk about the timing, because this is important and most coverage is burying it. Trump pointed to a specific window when a ceasefire announcement might come. Around the anniversary of the end of World War II. In Russia, that date is May 9th, known as Victory Day. It is the single most symbolically important holiday in the Russian calendar. It marks the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. There are massive military parades. There is enormous national pride attached to that date. Here's where it gets interesting. If Putin were to announce a ceasefire on or around Victory Day, he would not be framing it as a retreat or a concession. He would be framing it as Russia choosing peace from a position of strength on the most powerful symbolic date in the Russian national identity. That is a politically calculated move, and it is exactly the kind of move Putin has historically been drawn to. Trump seems to understand this dynamic. He is essentially giving Putin a political window, a moment where stepping toward peace serves Putin's own narrative at home. Whether that calculation holds, and whether Putin actually uses that window, we will know very soon. May 9th is not far away. Now here is the part of this story that came completely out of left field, and this changes the entire shape of the conversation. During the phone call, Putin did not just talk about Ukraine, he brought up Iran. Specifically, he proposed that Russia could help the United States seize approximately 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium believed to be stored inside Iran's atomic facilities. 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium. That is not a small number. That is the kind of material that, in the wrong hands, represents a serious global security risk. At face value, Putin's offer sounds almost cooperative, Russia stepping up to help handle a dangerous nuclear situation. But think about what accepting that offer would actually mean. It would mean inviting Russia into the center of one of the most sensitive and complex nuclear negotiations in recent history. It would give Moscow leverage, access, and influence in a situation where they currently have limited involvement. And this is the part that stood out most. Trump said no, flatly. He told reporters directly, "I said I'd much rather have you be involved with ending the war with Ukraine." That one line tells you exactly where the Trump administration's priorities are. Putin extended an offer to expand his role in global diplomacy around Iran. Trump looked at that offer and redirected the entire conversation back to Ukraine. He essentially told Putin, "The place I need your cooperation is in Europe, not in the Middle East." That is a deliberate choice, and it matters. Here's where it gets even bigger. Trump mentioned something during his Oval Office remarks that has not gotten nearly enough attention. He said he believes both the war in Ukraine and the situation involving Iran may be resolved on a similar timetable. A similar timetable. Two of the most complex geopolitical crises in the world, potentially moving toward resolution at roughly the same time. Now that could sound like an overreach, but consider what Trump pointed to as evidence. He noted that a temporary ceasefire in the Middle East had already helped restart negotiations around Ukraine. One situation stabilizing created space for movement in another. That is not just political talk. That is how interconnected global diplomacy actually works. What this suggests is that the Trump administration is not treating Ukraine and Iran as two separate problems. They are being managed as part of a broader strategic framework where progress in one area can unlock progress in another. That is an ambitious approach. It is also a fragile one, because if either situation unravels, it can pull the other one down with it. And this is the part that does not get said enough. Even if Trump and Putin reach an informal understanding, even if a ceasefire is announced around Victory Day, none of it works without Ukraine. President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government have been consistent on one point throughout this entire war. They will not accept an agreement that rewards Russian aggression. They have said that any framework freezing current front lines, with Russia still occupying large portions of Ukrainian territory, is not acceptable. So here is the central tension that no amount of optimism can paper over. Getting Trump and Putin aligned is one thing. Getting Ukraine to the table, on terms they can live with, is a completely different challenge. And without Ukrainian buy-in, a ceasefire is a headline, not a solution. This is exactly why the international community is watching this so carefully. European governments, NATO allies, and international institutions will all have opinions about any framework that emerges. Their support will determine whether a ceasefire has any real durability or whether it collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. So what should you actually be watching for in the days and weeks ahead? First, watch Moscow. Specifically, watch what comes out of Russia in the lead-up to May 9th. If Putin makes any kind of announcement related to a ceasefire around Victory Day, it confirms that Trump's reading of the call was accurate and that some kind of understanding has been reached. Second, watch Kyiv. Ukraine's response to any Russian announcement will immediately tell you whether this has any chance of holding. A positive or even neutral response from Zelensky would be significant. A flat rejection would tell you the diplomatic gap is still too wide to bridge right now. Third, watch the Iran situation separately. Trump turned down Putin's offer to get involved in the uranium question, which suggests the administration wants to keep those two tracks distinct. How the Iran nuclear negotiations develop will shape the overall diplomatic environment. And fourth, watch the calendar. Time is actually a factor here. Trump said relatively quickly. He pointed to a specific date. That means the window for action, if it exists, is narrow. If nothing happens around Victory Day, the momentum from this call could fade quickly. Here is the bottom line, and this is worth saying clearly. 4 years. That is how long this war has been going on. The longest, deadliest conflict in Europe since World War II. And for most of those 4 years, the honest assessment from diplomats and analysts was that there was no clear path to peace. Too much mistrust, too many competing interests, too much blood on the ground. And now, on a Wednesday afternoon, Donald Trump walks out of the Oval Office and says he thinks we are getting close to a solution. He says Putin might make an announcement. He says the timetable could align across multiple conflicts simultaneously. That is either one of the most significant diplomatic moments in years, or it is optimism that will not survive contact with reality. The difference between those two outcomes will become clear very soon. What is certain is this: the next few weeks around that May 9th window will be one of the most important periods in this conflict's history. Either something real happens, or the world learns once again how difficult it is to turn a phone call into peace. This is a story that is moving fast. If you want to stay ahead of it as it develops, follow along, because the next chapter could come any day now.